Have you ever had a moment like this? You run into someone who once felt very familiar, but now everything feels different. The conversation unfolds gently. No need to say much. No need to reopen what belongs to the past. It ends in a very human way. Each person returns to their own rhythm of life, and it almost feels like that meeting ends right there. But once the distance is far enough, once you're no longer standing in front of each other, a feeling quietly begins to surface inside someone. Hard to name, not very clear, no obvious reason. Just something that slows their steps and softly stirs a memory. Pisces tends to show up in people's lives this way. Not through grand gestures, but through emotion. Through a presence deep enough to help someone catch a glimpse of themselves. And from that lingering echo, this story begins to unfold. That reunion happened in a very ordinary way. Not like in a movie. There was no moment where time seemed to stop. No words strong enough to change the course of two lives. Everything passed softly, like an old afternoon, where two people sit across from each other and talk about the kinds of things anyone could talk about. Asking how life has been. Exchanging polite smiles. Bringing up a few memories that no longer feel sharp the way they once did. From the outside, it was just a meeting. And maybe it was exactly because it felt so ordinary that no one was on guard. Pisces tends to enter people's lives in this way, without making noise, without pushing in, without trying to leave a mark. You simply show up, fully present, quietly, as who you are in that moment. And then the meeting ends. Each person returns to the rhythm they know. The same familiar roads carry them back to places they walk through every day. But somewhere deep inside, something doesn't leave with their steps. Not an image, not a sentence, not anything clear enough to be named. Just a feeling that is both familiar and strange, like the scent of an old room you once lived in for a long time, even though you left it years ago, like a song whose melody you can't quite remember, yet it slows your heart the moment you hear it by chance. They don't try to think about you. In fact, they might believe everything ended a long time ago, but emotions don't follow logic. They don't obey plans. They simply appear when something real enough touches a part that hasn't fully healed. And you, in a very Pisces way, happen to do just that. Not because you talked too much, not because you tried to prove that you've changed, not because you wanted to be remembered, but because you weren't guarded. You didn't build a perfect version of yourself. You didn't hide the quiet spaces within you. You allowed yourself to be present as you are, with softness, with layers of emotion that aren't neatly arranged. That kind of presence carries a quiet power, because when someone comes face to face with that level of honesty, they're almost forced to look back at themselves, to revisit what they once avoided, to notice feelings they thought they were already fine with. That reunion didn't bring anything new. It simply opened a door leading back to an old place, where emotions once existed, were left behind but never truly disappeared. And when that door opens, even for just a moment, no one can pretend they've never stepped inside. Pisces, this isn't a story about whether someone will come back or not. It isn't a promise about where those feelings might lead. It's just a gentle reminder that your honest presence has the ability to awaken things deeper than you might realize. And sometimes, that alone is enough to turn an ordinary meeting into a memory that's not easily forgotten. Pisces steps into moments like these very gently, without trying to draw attention, without trying to steer the conversation in any direction. You let everything move at its own pace. Sometimes you simply sit there, listening fully. Sometimes you respond with just the right smile, or a few words that carry no hidden intention. And it's that sense of just enough that creates space for emotion to flow. Because when someone doesn't feel pressure to perform, they begin to soften. They talk more about themselves without even realizing it. They touch thoughts they've kept tucked away for a long time. Pisces doesn't lead through words. You connect through feeling, through eye contact that knows when to pause, through a kind of silence that doesn't leave the other person feeling empty. Your energy doesn't live in what's spoken. It lives in the sense of safety people feel when they're near you. A feeling that's hard to describe, yet easy to recognize, as if breathing slows down, as if they're allowed to be themselves without armor. After the meeting, they may not remember exactly what you said, but they remember how it felt to be near you. They remember the moment they were heard without judgment. I think they remember the feeling of being understood without having to explain. And that feeling doesn't disappear when the conversation ends. It follows them home, quietly slipping into the empty spaces of the day. When they're alone, when their thoughts begin to wander, when they suddenly realize they're reaching for something familiar. Pisces doesn't need to hold on to anyone. Your presence alone leaves an echo. And sometimes it's that echo that becomes the reason someone carries your image with them, even long after they've walked away. They don't sit down to organize their thoughts. They don't try to name the feeling. They don't look for a clear reason to explain it to themselves. Thinking about you arrives in a very different way. It doesn't knock. It doesn't announce itself. It simply appears, quietly, all like light sliding through a window at the end of the day. Sometimes it comes when everything suddenly slows down. Sometimes it shows up in a brief empty space, just enough for the mind to stop racing. And sometimes it happens in a very ordinary moment, when they're doing something familiar, yet suddenly realize the feeling inside no longer feels the same. You don't appear as a story that needs retelling, not as a clear memory filled with details, but as a vague sensation, hard to grasp, yet real enough that it can't be ignored. They may not remember exactly what was said. They don't remember who started the conversation. They don't remember how long the meeting lasted. What remains is the feeling that once existed when they were near you. The feeling of relaxing. The feeling of not needing to prepare an answer. The feeling of not having to prove anything. And that feeling returns in its own quiet way. In an afternoon where the light tilts gently downward, on a familiar road where thoughts usually pass through without settling. Or in a very small moment, when they suddenly notice their heart responding to something familiar. This feeling, I've known it before. The thought doesn't come out loud. It simply passes through, just enough to make them pause for a beat. You are not a memory that disrupts. You don't pull them back into the past. You don't force them to choose or decide anything. You're like a current flowing beneath the surface, not clearly seen, yet always present. A movement that hasn't closed. An emotion that hasn't found its period. Pisces connects in this way, not by leaving grand impressions, but through a presence deep enough to touch what's most real in another person. When they think about you, they're actually thinking about themselves, about feelings that were once overlooked, about spaces that were never fully filled, about a version of themselves that appeared when they felt safe. The reunion doesn't create new questions. It simply makes visible what was already there. And when that feeling returns, they don't try to hold on. They don't try to push it away. They just let it be there, as part of their inner current. Pisces, this isn't about how you are remembered. It's about how your presence creates space for someone else to touch their own emotions. And it's that quiet subtlety that makes you part of their thoughts. Not in the way they once imagined, but in a way that feels natural and deeply human. When that feeling returns, they begin to wonder what it was that touched them. And the answer isn't found in anything easy to see, not in appearances, not in the stories that were once told, not even in a promise left unfinished in memory. What makes them pause is something very different, a kind of honesty without armor. When they're near you, they don't feel examined. There's no need to explain everything perfectly. No need to prove they're okay, or strong, or already past it all. You don't push them back into the past. You don't pull them toward the future. You simply remain there, close enough for emotions to breathe. Pisces connects by creating this kind of space, a place without demands, a place without strategy, a place where someone can pause and gently let go of the roles they've been playing. That honesty isn't on display. It doesn't need a label, but it's clear enough to be felt when they walk away. They may not remember what you did. They may not remember anything important you said, but they remember how it felt to be near you, a feeling that rarely appears in everyday life, the feeling of being yourself, without defenses. And once someone has touched that state of being, it becomes hard to return to shallow connections, not because of comparison, but because they now know what depth feels like. Pisces doesn't try to hold on to anyone. You don't use emotion as a form of attachment. You don't trap others inside old stories. It's precisely this lack of grasping that makes the connection real. And because it isn't forced, the echo lasts a long time. They don't carry you with them out of obligation. They carry the feeling you opened inside them. A feeling that reminds them that somewhere within, there is still a very soft place. A place that had never been touched in that way before. Pisces. This isn't a story about whether someone comes back or not. It's a reminder that your honest presence always leaves a trace, even when you never intended it to. And once someone has felt what it's like to truly be themselves, they remember. Not because you are extraordinary, but because you gave them a moment that was deeply real. That reunion wasn't really about the two of them. It didn't need a shared story to hold its weight. It opened a very private space, one where they began to look inward. When they walked away, they didn't carry a conclusion. What followed them was a feeling slowly coming into focus, like light slipping through the clouds after days of gray. Not bright, not rushed. And just enough to see more clearly what had changed. They noticed they no longer reacted the way they once did. Things that used to confuse them now felt different. Some old choices suddenly felt unfamiliar. Some familiar habits quietly lost their meaning. That meeting didn't make them think about you as much as it made them think about themselves, about who they once were, about who they're becoming. And there were moments when they realized they'd been avoiding certain things for a long time. Not because they didn't know, but because they hadn't been ready to touch them. When they were near you, no one asked them to face those truths, yet your gentle presence allowed them to surface on their own, without judgment, without pressure. You were like a very different kind of mirror, not reflecting images, not repeating words, yet only reflecting emotion, honestly, without adding or taking away. When someone sees their own feelings through you, it becomes harder to keep looking away. They begin to notice the spaces that have existed for a long time, the desires that were never named, the limits they set for themselves to avoid getting hurt. That reunion didn't create change right away. It simply placed a very gentle question inside them, a question that didn't demand an immediate answer, a question quiet enough to follow them home. And in the quiet moments that came after, that question began to expand, not by pushing, but by bringing clarity. They started to see what no longer fit, what had reached the point of needing to be faced, what had been set aside out of fear of confrontation. Pisces doesn't try to become a guide. You don't offer advice. You don't arrange someone else's future. You're simply there, real enough for others to see themselves more clearly. And when they leave, what follows them isn't your image. It's an awareness slowly taking shape, a new sense of clarity, still fragile, but present. Pisces. This isn't a story about you changing someone. It's about how your presence allows others to look back on their own journey. You don't need to be the center. You don't need a special position. You only need to be yourself, with honesty that doesn't defend itself. And sometimes that's enough for a reunion to become a point of contact, where someone begins a deeper conversation with themselves. After everything, you don't stop to ask what they're thinking. You don't try to check whether that feeling still exists. And no questions are asked to force clarity where it isn't needed. Pisces chooses to keep moving forward as gently as the way you showed up from the beginning. Not because you don't care, but because you understand something very deeply. Real connections don't need to be held tightly in order to survive. You don't look for validation. You don't need a signal to know whether you mattered. You let everything remain where it belongs, a place where emotion can move freely. Some bonds only reveal their strength when they aren't controlled, when they aren't named too early, when they aren't pulled in a specific direction. Pisces believes this not as blind faith, but as an understanding shaped through quiet observation, watching how emotions move, watching how people come close and then drift apart. You know that if a connection still carries energy, it will find its own way to speak, no pushing, no reminders, and so you walk on. You don't turn back to see who might be following. You don't make things heavy with questions that don't yet need answers. Letting go isn't giving up. It's an act of respect for your emotions and for theirs. And within that release, an echo begins to form, when there's no longer direct presence, when there's no longer a conversation to hold on to. That's when emotion finally has room to reveal itself. They begin to notice the empty space, not because they're missing you in a literal sense, but because they're missing the feeling that once existed when they were near you. You aren't there to remind them. It's the softness of your absence that brings you back into their thoughts, not through longing, but through a very slow realization that some connections don't need to appear often, yet are still deep enough to remain for a long time. Pisces doesn't leave a mark through grand actions. You leave an echo by not interfering, by not distorting emotion with expectation, by not forcing everything toward a final conclusion. And that echo moves in its own quiet way. It shows up when someone is alone, when they no longer need to play a role, when they allow themselves to feel without explaining. They don't return because they were pulled. They return in thought because the emotion never fully closed. Pisces, this doesn't say how anyone will act. It simply reminds us that your non-grasping presence is already enough to create movement inside another person. You don't need to do anything more. No holding on, no pushing away. You only need to keep walking forward with the softness that is already yours. Because sometimes, the very way you leave is what allows someone else to stay, at least in the deepest corners of their thoughts. The lesson here isn't about waiting. It isn't about hoping someone will return or do something to confirm a feeling. This lesson is quieter than that. It begins when you pause and turn inward. Pisces often carries a familiar question. Is there something more I need to do? How do I go deeper? How do I matter more? How do I avoid being forgotten? But at some point along the path of growing up, that question begins to shift. It's no longer, what do I need to add? It becomes, am I being honest with myself? Because what makes you memorable has never lived in effort alone. It lives in the alignment between what you feel inside and how you show up in the world. When you live in tune with your own emotions, when you listen to your intuition instead of doubting it, when you allow yourself to be soft without calling it weakness, you naturally become a place of safety in someone else's life. Not everyone recognizes that right away, and not everyone knows how to hold it. But meaningful connections don't need many people. They only need depth. Pisces learns that there's no need to reshape yourself to meet someone else's expectations. No need to be clearer than you genuinely feel. No need to rush emotion faster than its natural rhythm. Your honesty has its own timing, and that timing isn't meant for everyone. Some people come close, feel it, and then move on. Not because you weren't enough, but because they weren't ready for the depth you carry, and that doesn't diminish your worth. The spiritual lesson for Pisces is learning to trust your own presence, to trust that you don't need to be chosen at all costs. You don't need to become something extraordinary in someone else's eyes. You only need to be yourself, with your intuition, with your sensitivity, with your ability to sense what's subtle and unseen. When you don't betray your own feelings just to hold on to a connection, you're giving both people a powerful gift, honesty. And from that honesty, meaningful bonds find their own way to remain. Maybe not in the form you expected. Maybe not in the place you once imagined, but they exist. In warm memories, in quiet appreciation, in the gentle feeling that comes when someone thinks of you with kindness. Pisces, you don't need to do anything more to be remembered. You only need to keep living in rhythm with your own emotions. Because this world will always need people who are brave enough to show up honestly. Brave enough to be soft, brave enough to be deep, and brave enough to believe that your value doesn't come from being held on to, but from being fully, truly yourself. If someone still thinks about you after seeing you again, it isn't because you tried to keep them close, not because you did anything beyond being who you already are, but because, in a very human moment, you touch something real inside them, a part often overlooked in the rush of everyday life, a part that had never been seen with that kind of gentleness before. You didn't awaken it with words, not with grand actions, only through an honest presence, all quiet enough for emotion to speak on its own. And once someone has touched that real part of themselves, they can't completely forget it, not in a clinging way, but in a deeply human way. Like a warm memory that remains, even when no one speaks its name anymore. Pisces carries a very special kind of energy. It doesn't find its way through logic. It doesn't need proof or validation. It simply moves silently along very subtle paths. Sometimes it stays in a passing thought. Sometimes in a familiar feeling that can't quite be named. Sometimes in a quiet moment when someone suddenly remembers what it felt like to be understood. That energy doesn't disappear when you walk away. It only changes form. It changes the way it exists. And most importantly, you don't need to control where it goes. Pisces, allow yourself to keep living in rhythm with your emotions. Continue to show up with softness, with intuition, with the depth that is uniquely yours. Not everyone will walk with you to the end of the journey, but everyone who has touched your energy carries something with them. Even if it's small, it's real, and that is enough. This story doesn't close with a conclusion. It simply pauses in a moment of stillness, a place where each person can feel what resonates and carry it forward in their own way. If you are Pisces, or if these words happen to touch you, remember that honest presence always leaves a trace, even when you never try to create one. Thank you for staying until this moment. We'll meet again in a very gentle moment when emotion leads the way.